Good afternoon. Well, it's a pleasure and a joy to welcome Joe Boyd, a bit of a legend in his own lunchtime or lifetime.
Very nice to be here, Peter.
Um, so we started. Well, I mean, before we started, I said he was a kind of Zelig, been everywhere, which he rather objected to, on the basis that Zelig didn't do very much. Whereas
Zelig was just in the background. He was just everywhere in the picture. So I
Was
always take it a little off that I get called a Zelig, but I understand the logic.
Okay, so also doing stuff, that's fair enough. So, the reason we heard Arnold Lane, because that was, you produced that, right?
I did.
And very unusual song about a kind of English pervert, basically.
Yeah, a panty sniffer.
Fancy sniff. Which, did it get banned by the
It
BBC?
got banned, which was, one way of looking at it was that gave it a boost.
Yeah.
But of course, it also didn't get much airplay, so it only got to number 15. But I was running the UFO Club at the time,
Right.
and the minute that came out, the crowds just expanded geometrically. We started having queues around the block, and the police searching everybody in the queue for drugs, and it all became a bit of a circus.
Well, in fact, the excuse is Joe's written this incredible 900-page book, which ranges throughout popular and global music in a really extraordinary way, really well written, researched, and so UFO is one of those places in 1967 one would like to be. One would also like to have been in, I don't know, the Tropicana Club in Havana in 1941, or you can imagine being in these places, right?
Well, that was one of the things that inspired me to write the book. I have shelves at home with lots of music books. And, I've got books on jazz and books on blues and books on pop. And I've got, biographies of everybody from Sam Cooke to Malcom Mclaren.
Right.
And, but I thought to myself, well, there's so many great characters outside our culture, outside the familiar backstories that everybody loves telling,
Right.
And so that was sort of the part of the initial
Also,
impetus.
part of it, you see, to me, I was writing about music, but I was thinking, it's like if you're a food writer, do you not write about Indian or Thai food, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It just seemed very Anglo-centric. I think part of it was probably in the 70s, I think you made the point, there was so much going on that it was only now we realize, even now people are digging crates of African music in the 70s or Brazilian stuff from the 70s. It just seems such a rich time for popular music around the world, really.
Well, yeah, it was. I mean, I think, it's the story every culture. I mean, Britain, France, America is no different in a way from Nigeria or Cuba or Japan or wherever, that as people migrated from the country to the cities across the end of the 19th century and across the 20th century, they brought their music with them.
Right.
And, of course, it had to be louder. It had to reach a bigger crowd. It had to compete with the motors, the internal combustion engine. It had to compete with the urban soundscape. And so it got louder, it got more electric, it got added saxophones and drum kits, and in fascinating ways everywhere. And those mixtures, those cross-cultural connections, I just found fascinating, and you can hear them,
Sure. I think part of your point of view, which I think is proven many times, is that what we think of as Anglo-American pop music, which everyone knows, has roots elsewhere, whether it's rock and roll or I was just thinking about, the contemporary classical stuff, like Steve Reich and Philip Glass. It's all got roots elsewhere, which people aren't very aware of, and you make people aware of that.
Lamont Young and Steve Reich were completely obsessed with Pandit Pran Nath, a classical Hindustani vocalist with unbelievable pitch control in his
Right,
voice,
right,
and
right.
that was an obsession
And
for
studied
them.
in West Africa, I think.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so, and if you go back, I know you got Stravinsky on your thing. You've got and there's like Ravel and Debussy going to see the Gamelan.
Exactly. But I think one of the points that I make, not too forcefully, I maybe should have made it more forcefully, but in the last chapter, I talk about the fact that a lot has been written about how Picasso and Debussy and even earlier, that Goethe was obsessed with gypsies and
Right.
their
Yeah,
lifestyle.
yeah.
And that this search for the quote primitive,
Yeah.
as they used to call this, fueled the evolution of modernity.
Right.
That-
Of course.
That's
yes,
what
yes.
triggered the Romantic movement, and there was all this sort of quest for some sort of injection of something new.
Something authentic.
Yeah,
whatever.
and the way Liszt listened to Roma bands and all this kind of stuff. But meanwhile, this was all going on in the intellectual sphere, the kind of high peaks of culture.
Right.
But the people on the street, the average person, was way ahead of the intellectuals. They were
Right.
dancing to the waltz, which was a folk dance, the mazurka, and then eventually to the cakewalk and the grizzly bear, and then the tango, and that was what defined modernity. You were square and old-fashioned if you didn't have an injection of Afro-Cuban or Afro-American or Afro-Brazilian rhythms into your Western music.
Well, also, there's a lot of rather fascinating. Sometimes it goes other ways. I mean, I was just reading about your, the contra dances and the quadrilles that went, and then you could still find quadrilles in Guadeloupe, whereas you could be pushed to find them in Paris anymore.
Absolutely. I mean, as you say, the thing went both ways. And the effect, for example, of James Brown on African music in the 70s was immense, because people were fascinated because it was a mirror in a way. It was like people in West Africa were listening to James Brown and thinking, this sounds kind of African, and so they could relate to it and take what he had developed in terms of pushing the...
But then James Brown saw Fella and borrowed from him
Exactly.
as well.
It's that's part of the bottom line, I guess, what I get to in the book is that all music is a mixture. It's all borrowed. It's all cross-culturally merged.
I heard this story, which I'd like to be true, that Robert Kraft, who was Stravinsky's biographer, asked the great man, like 2 weeks before he died, so Igor, who are the greats? And he said, the 4 Bs, Bach, Brahms, Beethoven, James Brown. Apparently he said that.
And he deliberately, as I point out in the book, he deliberately missed out Bartok.
Okay.
He really didn't like Bartok. He felt very condescending about Bartok, the way Bartok loved folk music and based a lot of his adventure, some explorations of modernity on traditional music that he had recorded in the Carpathian Mountains.
I mean, you have got some Stravinsky on your playlist, actually, a bit of the Rite of Spring. That was,
I would, because I think, in a way, Bartok is a bit more, anyway. But, I mean, there's so many, you can go in so many directions, and here, I mean, should we have a little more music?
Yeah, let's have some more music.
Yeah, what I was going,
let's go to Riverman, because we've lined it up.
Yeah, we have.
So,
but before we play it, let me just say, because I think we should segue from that.
Okay.
There's Nick Drake was always mysterious. People found him like, where did that come from?
Right.
And we've discovered that a lot came from his mother.
Yeah.
Who wrote songs in the style of, Noel Coward. And,
I've heard a few of that.
And she had this weird way of voicing her chords, which Nick does on the guitar, which she was doing on the piano. But many, many years after he died, I started to hear in his music another influence. And I asked a friend of his, I said, did you ever see this one particular artist in his record collection? And he said, yeah, I did. So anyway, we're going to hear a little bit of Riverman, and then we'll go to this other
All
artist
right,
and show
very
you the
good.
connection.
Let's see if this works. So that was Desafinado from
Joao Gilberto.
Joao Gilberto from 59, 61.
Yeah, around then. And you know, once I started over the years, many years after Nick passed away, I got more and more into listening to Joao Gilberto.
Right.
And then I started writing about him in the book.
Yeah.
And his character and the way he stood out or stood to one side and hid in the background, the whole scene in Copacabana, reminded me very much of Nick, although he ended up, of course, surviving and becoming an international sensation.
Still quite introvert in a way. I saw him, I think, at a jazz festival in Italy. It was like 2 in the morning or something, and he was just being, just...
Yeah. No, he was very introverted guy, and the story of how he invented that way of playing the guitar is wonderful. I mean, he was a loser. He smoked a lot of dope. He slept on people's sofas. He was just kind of, nobody liked him much.
Yeah.
And he ended up left Rio and stayed with his sister for 6 months, way up in the provinces. And she had a tiled bathroom. And he used to sit in the bathroom on a chair, and the tiles were made an acoustic so that he could play the guitar really quietly and hear it really clearly and sing really quietly, and the reverberations brought it right back to him. And so he started experimenting with using his voice in harmony with the guitar, and using the guitar, strumming the guitar in patterns that he heard on records where the accordion was playing that, or the trombone was playing that. And he completely changed, because the guitar wasn't a big Brazilian instrument before that. And so suddenly, when he got back to Rio, people went, what the hell is that? And at first they thought it was just weird. And then he put out a record, and kids just started buying it, and it just took off.
Right.
And it created this worldwide sensation of bossa nova. Anyway, but the whole story of bossa nova and Brazil.
Yeah, well, this
and
kind of stories about these characters and these little details in the book is great. It's like Joao Gilberto's bathroom, or his sister's bathroom, whatever. And I think, well, to me, I suppose, because I was one of the 3,000 people who bought Pink Moon when it came out, when I was like, that was the first Nick record I bought. And I don't know, I was 15 or something. But it was, and I was reading metaphysical poetry, John Donne and people like that, and being a depressed teenager. And finally I thought, it's not just black people who suffer. It's like upper middle class people like me suffer. This is my music in a way.
Well, I think that's one of the things that has happened over the years because of my connection, with Nick. I get a lot of demos.
Right.
From people who say, please listen to my songs. I'm so in love with Nick Drake. He's my hero. It's who I base my whole. And you listen, and somebody's singing very quietly into the microphone and strumming the guitar. And, I mean, there's so many ways in which they're nothing like Nick.
Right.
But one of the most important is lyrics. And because Nick, obviously like you, had studied the canon. He knew John Donne. He knew Andrew Marvell. He knew, Keats and Shelley. And he'd had a proper education. And his lyrics
the lyrics were quite...
they're really...
well crafted and everything, and poetic. As indeed the actual guitar player is very strong technique, and the lyrical technique very strong. So presumably he was he expected to be the next Leonard Cohen and was depressed when he wasn't? Or was
Well,
that part of it?
I don't know about expected. He certainly wanted. I mean,
Yeah.
to be known and for people to hear his music,
Yeah.
and the fact that nobody really got it in his lifetime was
Well, I wish I'd
crushing.
written to him when I booked Pink Moon or something.
Exactly.
Because, it was, we all my friends thought this is amazing piece of music, And also, that was even more stripped down than the orchestral stuff, string
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
It was really the last one he did, right? It's really stripped down.
Yeah, yeah.
Very powerful.
And in a way, it's another similarity to Gilberto. Was Gilberto, when he was trying to get a record deal, the record company said, nah. And then the thing that convinced them to let him do it was he said, I don't want any orchestra. I just want just me and one other musician. And they booked two drummers, and he tried to fire them both during the first session.
Okay.
And they finally convinced him to let one of them just tap quietly along.
Okay.
But he wanted it simple. He kept wanting it stripped down and simple.
Yeah. Well, that was also, if you think that time, there was a lot of more and more, elaborate progressive rock stuff. Much as I
Well,
quite
no, I
like.
don't know about progressive. There wasn't a progressive
70.
rock.
What time is it? 70.
No, 60s.
When did Pink
Pink
Moon?
Nick
Pink Moon.
Drake,
I'm talking about.
Yeah, Nick, okay. Yeah, that was 71. And there was Nick was. Out
So it
of
was going
time.
against the grain at the same way.
He was out of time. Yeah, but he didn't have that moment that Joao had with. His
And that's
first
sort
hit.
of, I wonder if he's, looking down, realizing, bloody hell, I've sold 3 million records, or more by now, I imagine, millions of records.
Well, I don't know about millions, but he's sold. I mean, he's done. He's done very well. I mean, I had a moment when I watched Searching for Sugar Man.
Right.
There's this scene where he comes to South Africa after 10 years or something,
Yeah.
and everybody there's been a report that he was dead.
Right.
And he was a big star there, sort of a cult figure.
Yeah.
And so suddenly there he is announced in a concert, and there's 10,000 people in a big arena, and who thought he was dead. And he walks out on stage, and everybody goes crazy. And it was so distressing for me to see that scene, because I just kept thinking, why couldn't that be Nick?
Do you have any regrets about not, you were in America, or I don't know, do you have any sort of regrets?
Well, I mean, sure, I always think about what could I have done differently.
I mean, it's impossible to know, but anyway,
I mean, but in those days, things that are obvious to people, even like 3 or 4 years later.
Right.
If somebody has very complicated guitar tunings, you have another guitar off stage and somebody tuning it, and then you rush on stage and hand it to him. Right. But nobody did that in those days. And so Nick would just sit there on stage, no jokes, and retune the guitar, because he had these very complicated tunings. And people started lost the thread. They started talking amongst themselves, and it was very demoralizing for him. Anyway, that's...
Yes, all right. Well, let's try something else. Is this Longhairs? Is this Longhairs Blues? Is this
that's a
Professor Longhair?
Professor Longhair, yes.
All right, let's have a bit of Professor Longhair. So that was Professor Longhair, I believe. I mean, and he had a group called the Shuffling Hungarians.
Did he?
At one point. He didn't. Okay.
Well, what I know about his early life, he used to play in New Orleans bars down by the waterfront.
Yeah.
And he used to run into a lot of Cuban musicians who were working on the boats, and they used to have jams. And he was always obsessed with Cuban music.
Interesting, yeah.
And New Orleans is such an interesting city, and I've spent quite a bit of time on it in the book, because
sure, absolutely.
It's like a drip feed that feeds this Caribbean complexity into African American.
Also, Professor Longhair had big hands. That helped in how he played. But I think, this thing about, because New Orleans is a sort of French African Catholic place, and as opposed to the more Puritan most of America. So
I mean,
that's a big thing, right?
yeah, and the fact that in North America, the Protestant settlers, the English, the Scottish, whatever, they would never allow the slaves to play drums. They would never allow them to speak an African language. They would never allow them to worship an African god.
Right.
Their culture was completely suppressed in North America. Whereas in Cuba and in Haiti, the French and the Spanish understood that what's the problem? It's a bit like the Roman Empire, which is the sort of predecessor of the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
They would capture people, bring them to Rome in chains, and then let them set up their deity, their little temple to their god, in one part of Rome and worship there. And the Spanish and the French said, yeah, sure, you want to worship Ogun, you want to worship,
Well, there seemed to, but there still was this syncretism between, Lazaro and Babaluaye or whatever.
Yeah, and eventually, a lot of Africans who came from Angola and Congo had already been exposed to Catholicism in Africa by Portuguese missionaries.
Right.
And then they'd made this kind of understanding with the Catholics that if we want to pretend that, one of our gods is actually Santa Barbara, or vice versa, the priest says, fine, whatever you, because it's interesting, Catholicism and Islam really are often based more on ritual and practice than philosophy and belief. It's like Protestants can argue forever about what is the nature of the Trinity, but the Catholics don't care what you think is the nature of the Trinity, just so long as you cross yourself.
Yeah, I was just trying to look at...
what are you after there?
Selena Gonzalez, Santa Barbara. It's
Selena Gonzalez, yeah.
Let's see if we get this one up. Okay, so that was illustrating your point about Santa Barbara.
Yeah.
And Django.
That was a huge hit in 70s Cuba. The first time the communists allowed anything about African gods to be in the kind of public media.
Well, it's important to me that my first time to Cuba was 86, I think, and I did an interview with Selena Gonzalez.
Oh, yeah.
Which was, everyone thought I was Russian, which was interesting. But then, you got a discount if you were Russian to get into Tropicana. But anyway, Selena Gonzalez, she had a big, obviously this mixture there of Santa Barbara and Shango, who was the Yoruba Orisha of thunder and also protector against AIDS later on. Anyway, important figure for sure.
But she's a fascinating character, as I described. She's a bit like a Dolly Parton. She was a white country girl, Cuban white country girl, singing about Afro-Cuban deities.
Right.
And I say it's a bit like Dolly Parton singing "Got My Mojo Working."
Okay.
It was a bit incongruous, but huge hit, and you heard it everywhere in Cuba in the 70s.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's fantastic. And I did it for the Morning Star. Article, the interview, which was, but they sent me, so I also sent into the Havana Libre, which was the renamed Hilton.
Yeah.
And I met people in the Hotel Nacional. They said, so they put you on the 17th floor, right? Because you're a journalist. I had to get the journalist visa.
All the rooms were tapped.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I had this, anyway, it was all great. I actually met Castro. I got invited to a do at the Palace of the Revolution, that was pretty extraordinary.
I mean, one of the themes that pops in and out of the book is how uncomfortable communism has been with authenticity,
right,
and with traditions.
Because
I mean, in some ways, for a philosophical reason, they're creating a new world.
Yeah.
They're creating a new working class. They're creating a new society. And so anything which smacks of history, which smacks of the past,
Right.
has to be eliminated. So, for example, all through the 60s, you could not hear what people think of as Cuban music on Cuban radio because the commissars hated it.
Well, they also hated religion, I suppose.
Well, yeah, they hated religion, but they also hated anything that sounded like the corrupt, Castro made speeches in which he described people going to dance every night as lizards and corrupt,
Yes.
debauched.
Well, that's an interesting area.
And the same thing happened in Russia, that there was this hostility on the part of Stalin and the commissars towards peasant music.
Yeah. Well, it became academic. I met Alim Kazimov, from and his big thing, he found this cassette from about 1911 done by some Dutch ethnomusicologist. And it was like that, okay, now this is how it's supposed to sound.
Right.
The Sufi stuff. Whereas it'd been very academicized.
Yeah, well, it's been completely crushed because the whole idea, for example, of Sufi music, the idea that you can sing about a girl and sing about God in the same words, completely befuddled the commissars. They had no room for that.
No.
And they went into, they conquered Central Asia, and they go in there and they see these long-necked stringed instruments with no frets.
Yeah.
What do you mean no frets?
Yeah.
How can you have something that's so disorderly as a fretless instrument? So they brought in technicians to redesign the dombra and all these Central Asian instruments with frets, which completely destroyed the sliding, sensual, nature of that music.
Sure. Well, I think the whole theme of your book is like the notes between the notes, and I think that's. But just in favour of the communists, the Bulgarian choir, that was a communist invention, the one that we love,
Listen,
right?
absolutely.
So it wasn't all bad, is my point.
Well,
they did. That was an interesting cultural production, which the communists did like, and we liked.
In Bulgaria only.
Yeah, Bulgaria.
But the Kutev ensemble, which was a national ensemble,
right.
the kind of Bulgarian equivalent of the Moiseyev ensemble in the Soviet Union. I spoke to Philip Kutev's daughter, Elena Kuteva,
Right.
and she told me that right after the choir was formed in late 1940s, early 50s, they went for a short tour to Russia, and the Russians hated them, never invited them back, and because Kutev loved peasant music and peasant voices, and he built his whole creation around the sound of the village singing, whereas Moiseyev hated village singing and was determined to reinvent folk music in a modern way. That was
I couldn't resist. I couldn't resist putting that on in the middle of that.
That lead voice is the voice of Yanka Rupkina,
Okay.
who was the diva of Bulgaria and who I worked with a lot. She was part of Trio Bulgarka. And we toured a lot with her, and I recorded her in Sofia. And she really was a Bulgarian Dolly Parton, big blonde hair, big larger-than-life personality, wonderful woman, amazing character. But the communist regime, one of the problems with judging this as communism, because fundamentally, it turns out that once you scratch most communist regimes, they're nationalist regimes more than communist. And, certainly Putin, is turning out to be first and foremost a Russian nationalist, as is Xi in China. He's turning out to be a Han Chinese nationalist. He wants to suppress all other cultures. It's not about suppressing deviation from the workers' paradise. It's about suppressing anybody who isn't Han or anybody who's not Russian or any culture. That's why he hates. That's why he's invaded Ukraine, because they have the temerity to say we're a separate culture. We're not Russian.
And they're also a bit more. It's like to me, it's like you've got something like equivalent would be something like Germany to Italy. In other words, the Ukrainians are a bit warmer. They got more sea. And they, you know, what I mean?
Or the Ukrainians.
The Ukrainians are a bit more Italian.
Yeah, well, a little bit, yeah.
A little bit, maybe.
But, I mean, you know, that thing that we see today and with the invasion of Ukraine goes back a long way. It goes back in 1830 or something.
Mm-hmm.
Gogol published a book collection of Ukrainian folk tales, which was a huge hit.
Right.
And a great Ukrainian writer published his own book of Ukrainian folk tales in Ukrainian, and was sent to Siberia for it. And then in the 30s, Stalin assembled, put out a call to all the Ukrainian banduristi, the kind of bards of the Ukrainian culture, for a conference in Odessa. And they arrived, and they were all shot. So
I don't mind laughing. It's not very funny, but yeah, I think.
So it's been more about Russian nationalism and Russian chauvinism than it has been about communism.
Well, the other good thing about communism was that.
The other good thing. What was the first one?
The Bulgarian choirs, which were an artificial thing, was that the level of education about things like classical music was extraordinary, and they would have. So you used to go and see the Mariinsky or ballet, and the people would know. The taxi drivers would know the ballerinas. And they would have this, fantastic, some of the best violinists in the world came from Siberia or Odessa or wherever.
Yeah.
And so that was musically, that was a strong point of communism.
That was for sure.
And but when it came to jazz, it's quite interesting. I went to the Odessa Jazz Festival, and they were talking about how jazz. I think certain types of jazz were okay, like Glenn Miller was all right, but then
it depends. It was more to do with the year than the style.
All right.
Because when they were aligned with the U.S. During the Second World War, Glenn Miller was fine because they wanted to encourage collaboration between America and Russia.
Right.
But then after the war, swing or American jazz was suddenly not all right. At all, until Stalin died, and then it became all right for a while, and then there was a backlash to Khrushchev's thaw, and it became not all right, and then it became all right again.
But I believe there was a sort of debate between Izvetsya and Pravda as whether it was bourgeois.
Yeah, that was back in the 30s.
That was in the 30s. Okay. But I think it was interesting, the edges of the empire, places like Odessa or like, Vilnius or wherever, they got the ships in, right? So they could actually hear jazz. They'd play it on, when the restaurants are closed, they'd be playing, forbidden jazz music, or there's stories that they would play them on hospital X-rays or something.
Well, they cut. That was rock and roll. They cut Elvis records onto hospital X-rays with a lathe. But I have a story in the book about Willis Conover, who was the jazz announcer on Voice of America, which no Russian was ever supposed to listen to. And he went to Russia on a holiday as a private individual.
Right.
And didn't sort of announce it or tell anybody he was going. He just went with his wife or whatever to see the sights. And somebody in a cafe discovered that this guy, this American tourist who was, in his cafe, was Willis Conover. And he said, and he was part of a little sort of underground jazz club in St. Petersburg, in Leningrad. And so he... they persuaded him to come and announce one of the groups that night. And so Willis Conover came in and did as requested and introduced this group. And everyone in the club recognized his voice and ran to the stage to demand autographs in St. Petersburg, in Leningrad.
Right. Well, just a cue, we can play this just because we can see if that works. Where was that song written?
In Rishikesh, at the Maharishi's retreat
I
over
didn't know
breakfast.
that.
Over breakfast, when Mike Love of the Beach Boys and Paul McCartney started jamming.
By the way, I saw Paul McCartney 2 weeks ago, just before Christmas. And he was remarkably great, actually.
Yeah, I'm sure.
At an advanced age, I mean, probably, I don't know how old you are, but similar age. I mean, very good form. And it's rather encouraging that you can be, I mean, the band were great. I mean, and of course, he's done some really pretty bad stuff, but he actually has a selection of fantastic songs,
Yeah,
and
of course.
there was like it was like a religious meeting practically.
Yeah.
I mean, he was fantastic.
And listen, any misgivings I had about him were sort of erased by watching the 6-hour documentary, Get Back, or whatever it was called.
Yeah.
Because he's so great in it. He's so, he's the one keeping it all together and encouraging everybody and sort of moving everything forward in a really sort of positive way. And you really warm to him so much in that, watching that.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of people, there's not many people who have a super creative and have good executive function. They don't necessarily go together.
Right.
As I'm
But
sure
they
you
did with
found
him,
being as a record company boss.
But I want to take you up on your point about good communists. I have a track that I brought, which, and the point that I made about it's a, I'll do it in a second. It's the point I made about communism in most cases, communist governments being at heart nationalistic.
Right.
And in the mid-'80s in Bulgaria, when the economy was tanking, people were very discontented, Todor Zhivkov introduced totally nationalistic policies. He made everybody take a Bulgarian name. Any name that wasn't Bulgarian, they had to change it to a Bulgarian name. And he wouldn't allow anyone to speak Turkish in public, and it was all this very paranoid stuff. And meanwhile, there was this burgeoning scene of wedding bands. And these weddings got wilder and wilder and bigger, and the money was flowing because there was nothing else to spend your money on. Because they didn't have any cars to sell, they didn't have any fridges to sell. So people spent all their money on big parties. And so the Roma bands that were playing for the weddings became the biggest artists, and they became rich. And one of them was the guy that I heard, Ivo Popazov, an incredible musician, and his band was incredible. And so we got a track by him.
That one, okay.
Just
hold it 1 minute. I just wanted to. One of the things which I thought was fascinating, which I vaguely thought, was the notion of the Beatles and old-style communism in the same world. They sort of were, it's an unstable thing. One was going to win. And you had that friend, a guy quotes saying, as soon as he heard Girl, was it 30 seconds, he realized he'd be told. I mean, that was an extraordinary moment. I think it's, and I've heard this from other people.
Yeah.
That in a way,
There's
the
a whole
Beatles
movie about it called When the Beatles Rocked the Kremlin.
Okay, I haven't seen it, but it's, I mean, I think the Beatles had more of an impact in Russia than they did in England or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sort of, I'm not really exaggerating. I mean, they changed, I think that whole system, something I couldn't survive with people who heard the Beatles. So, it didn't have that impact here. We still have the same system.
Well, but I think, and in a way, the Beatles and Christine Keeler changed Britain. I think in the early 60s,
Well, I think that the changing of the class system up to a point.
Well, they didn't transform it, but they shifted it for sure, and they made sex sort of popular.
Yes, whatever that Larkin thing was, sex was.
Yeah, sex began, and something began.
1963.
Yeah.
After the Beatles' first LP, but too late for me. Something like that.
Something like that. Yeah.
Okay, let's hear a bit of this track.
Of Ivo Popazov. This was party music. And this changed Bulgaria. This music.
All right, so.
Yeah, that music caught the imagination of the youth in Bulgaria. They flocked. People kids from the cities were coming out to weddings in the
Right, right.
countryside. And you'd see policemen who shut down one wedding party one weekend would appear in plain clothes dancing at the next weekend.
Okay, okay. But he was put in
But
jail,
He
right?
was put in jail for
Well,
singing in Turkish lyrics, yeah.
That was the reason, okay.
Yeah.
Because you were also one of the. I mean, sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but as we come back to it, you make the point really that a lot of the most powerful music, quite a few people end up in jail or
Yeah.
as a kind of because it is a political threat or whatever. And he was, but he was. So what happened? He was in jail and then he came out again, and he was a star
he
again.
was only in jail for 4 weeks or something, and he became the biggest star in Bulgaria. And one person said he was probably, by the time the wall came down, he was probably the richest man next to Toto Zhivkov in Bulgaria.
Okay.
Um,
Wow.
And the government was just completely beside themselves. They didn't know, what to do, because it was just so popular, and nobody was buying the records of these state ensembles anymore. Nobody
Right.
was going to concerts. Nobody was going to party youth congresses. Everybody, all they wanted to do was go, listen.
Well, it is fantastic music. I would say, when I've been to Romania, I went to some festival there, and it was classical festival. But when I said I like gypsy music, they really don't like the gypsies there at all. So there's still, I mean, it's not like, I think there are different countries have different appreciation for.
Well, the
gypsy music.
Romanians have a long, bad history with
Yeah.
Roma.
Yeah.
For 400 years, Roma were slaves in Romania.
Right.
They couldn't move anywhere without permission from their owner, and who would buy the prettiest teenage girl and then sell her on to his friend, a couple of years later when he got tired of her. And they were treated like chattel.
Right, right.
And so the history, and the Romanians today, I think, are quite annoyed that gypsies are no longer called gypsies; they're called Roma.
Yes,
And
sorry.
people
I'm never quite sure with this. Where you. I did a piece for the Observer living with these pygmies. I said, "What do you want to be called?" And they said, "Pygmies." So I said,
Right.
"Well, okay. Well, if you call yourself pygmies, I'll call yourself."
Yeah.
But it's it's difficult to know the terminology always. But gypsies is definitely out.
Well, it was interesting because one of the big sections in the book starts back in the 5th century A.D. when a king in Persia asked his father-in-law, who was a sultan in Rajasthan, to send him a bunch of musicians, and supposedly there were like 10,000, musicians were shipped from Rajasthan to Persia, who were part of a caste, very low caste, whose function in society was to play music.
Right, right.
And some of them fixed pots. And they came to Persia, and then they had a dispute with the king, and he kicked them out, and they all kept moving west. And this is the origin of the Roma people, because their language is directly connected to Rajasthani. And they kept moving over the centuries through Armenia, through Turkey, Greece, and when they got to Europe, whenever somebody would ask them where they came from, they discovered that the best answer, the answer that got them the best treatment, the one that got them a free meal, was to say, "We're from Egypt."
Okay, I
And
didn't know that.
And then the slang of the time, "Oh, you're Egyptians, gypsies."
Right, right.
And that's how the word gypsy evolved.
Well, actually, I mean, I'm going back to your wedding thing. I mean, I think we met. I seem to recall we met at some swimming pool in Fez for the Sacred Music Festival 15 years ago or something. And I did something that happened there. When I first went to Fez, which had been 30 years ago, somehow the Isawa groups in the weddings were being phased out because it was more modern to have electronic keyboard player and cheaper.
Yeah.
But then, last time I went, it had shifted again, partly
To the Sacred Music Festival?
I'm saying the weddings in Fez.
Oh, okay.
So now they have Isawa groups again,
Okay.
partly because the foreigners have come and said how much they like this music.
Right. Well, that's
So that is a dynamic which
Yeah.
you explore in the book, but I thought
Yeah.
it was a good
a
example.
very good
really.
example. Yeah.
And I think let's hear some music, and we'll discuss that more.
Am I on now?
We're on. Well, we
We're on.
started with
Ibrahim Ferrer.
Ferrer,
And you could-
Kebala by Usted, which was very similar to Benny Moray's
Yeah,
version.
yeah. It's a very nice cover of Benny Moray's. And in a way, you could title these two tracks The Adventures of Western Producers in Cuba.
Yeah.
Nick
Well,
Gold.
yeah.
Nick Gold, and who was a producer of, he along with Ry Cooder, was a producer of the Buena Vista Social Club,
Right, right.
which was an accident.
Yes. Well, again, it's a long
It's a
tale.
long tortured
By the
tale.
way, we mentioned Selena Gonzalez. Is it true that she was she was offered a gig as part of Buena Vista, and she threw the shells, and the gods told her no? That's what I heard.
I don't know that story. But
Okay, I just
I
told
can
that one.
believe it. I can believe it. It makes sense that she would have been invited.
Yeah.
But no, that whole thing happened because it was supposed to be a collaboration between Cuban and Malian musicians,
Right.
and the Malians didn't get on the plane.
Okay, so why did the Malians not get on the plane?
Because there was this Malian guy who suddenly reappeared in Mali, having left the country years before, with vast amounts of money,
Okay.
doling out money to musicians,
Right, right.
and they all adored him. He gave
Yeah.
the great
As the-
musicians
yeah, yeah.
Mercedes cars and
right,
bought
right,
somebody
right.
a house, and et cetera, et cetera. And just when they were getting ready to go to Cuba to meet
Yeah.
this collaborative thing, word went around that Baba, whatever his name is, I'm sorry, I forgot it right now.
It's in the book.
Yeah, it's in the book. Was coming to town, and was planning to have a big party and give away a lot of stuff.
Right.
And so the musicians all somehow said, "Well, we didn't get our visas in time," and they didn't get on the plane. And so Nick Gold and Ry Cooder were stuck in Havana with a bunch of musicians who were there for this collaboration. And they thought, well, I guess we better do something. And so they started recording old songs. And the result was the biggest selling, so-called world music record of all time.
So do you think, this dynamic, I mentioned this after we'd said the Westerners came to Fez and started liking Isawa,
Yeah.
and then that gave us something, a revival to the Isawa as far as credibility goes.
Yeah.
This happens quite a lot. So I suppose in Cuba, at the time, people were listening to a lot of, Miami hip-hop or something. And
They were listening. They were listening to Los Van Van. They were listening to modern Cuban music.
Yeah. La Titi Mania was one of my favorites.
Right.
I saw Los Van Van. But they also listened to American music as well, no?
Well, they could. It was not that easy.
Right,
You
right.
could get in trouble still in those days, in the early 90s.
Energía La Banda, maybe.
En La Banda, of course, and
All that stuff.
El Médico de la Salsa. And stuff
Okay,
like
so
that.
basically the point being, the locals thought this stuff was old-fashioned and a bit sort of corny.
Exactly.
But it's because, because the argument would be, it's rather paternalistic, these white, cultural, whatever, impresario colonialists to come over and, but in fact, I think you can claim there was a beneficial effect for Cubans and financially. In fact, I met the Minister of Tourism in Havana. He said that record saved the revolution because it was an amazing advert, and they, brought all the tourists. Hundreds and hundreds of musicians went around bringing in hard currency.
Yeah, and you could say the same for Graceland. People criticized it for breaking the boycott, but it played a very key role in bringing down apartheid.
Yeah.
It put a lot of pressure on the South African government and helped pass the embargo act in Congress in America.
Well, I suppose, one argument would be, Well, we have sort of a certain amount of what they call these days white privilege, but that's a fact, so you may as well use it in a beneficial way.
Well, I look at it differently. I think that it's just part of there were musicians in the Congo, in Leopoldville, in the 40s, who were listening to records by Jimmy Rogers,
Right.
The American country singer, the blue yodeler,
Right.
and listening to records by Hawaiian guitar players,
Yeah, yeah.
and listening to records by Cuban bands, by
Yeah.
Trio Matamoros.
Uh-huh.
And they took these three things and they blended them with their own music and came up with something fantastic. And it's just that music there is no purity about music. It crosses borders, it swims oceans, it flies across mountain ranges, and it just always will, and it takes many different forms. And I think I have a quote in the book from sort of thinker called Bakhtin, who says basically you can never assess a culture except by standing outside it. And I think that's true, of music, that sometimes the clearest-eyed view, objective view of a culture comes from outside. And
Well, that may, and I think we've all had experience. I went to South Africa on this music village. I don't know if you went to any of those, but it was, and they were saying, "Yeah, we got this singer. It sounds like Madonna. It's going to be great." And I was sort of like, "So why the hell do you want to hear this old music?" You know what I mean? You probably had that experience a few times. Sure. I'm trying to find now which version of El Manicero should we do. 'Cause I think this is a good point to play that track.
Okay. What have we got? What's our choice? We got Bola de Nieve,
Perez Prado, Oscar de Leon, Bebe Valdez. We want is one of the early ones, don't we?
Yeah.
All right. Tell me who you think. Who was the first guy to do it?
Well, the first.
Rita Montaner.
No, we don't want to hear that. That was one of the first, but it's not very good. It's a Machine. Oh no, it's what's it called? Don Aspiasu.
That's the one. Yeah.
That's the one we want.
There we go. All right. So this is the reason I'm playing this is because this, I believe, was the first record put out in West Africa on RCA Victor or something.
Maybe, but the real importance of this song is that this was the song. There was a Cuban group that was invited to join a variety show on Broadway in 1929 or 30. And this song brought down the house, and this is the song that created a craze for Cuban music in America and started the whole industry of Latin music.
Well, my understanding, which could be wrong, was that the first release RCA, I think, put out in West Africa was this.
Yeah, but that was years later.
Yeah, years later. But people liked it. And that was one of the reasons why a lot of the West Africans we like Youssou Adore, play kind of Cuban-related music because it was it was a hit, and then they.
Well, it wasn't just El Manicero; it was like a whole series.
All right, let's talk about this and hear a bit of this, and we can carry on.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that song is such a classic example of how music is mongrel, music is mixed, music is not defined. It's not a folk song at all.
Yeah.
It was written by a Jewish Cuban composer named Moises Simons.
Okay.
And because the star called Rita Montaner heard a melody, he wrote an instrumental with that melody. And she said, "Come on, I want to sing that melody, write some words." And he was thinking, "What can I do?" And he was singing at a cafe, supposedly, and heard a cry of a peanut seller.
Okay.
Saying, "Money, money."
Yeah.
And so he used that and wrote this song.
Okay, interesting.
And then other people say that melody came from the American composer and pianist and my mind is going blank right now. Who was the mid 19th century star that I talk about in the book.
Mm. American.
Yeah, American, who was trained in France. Anyway, he traveled all around the Caribbean, and he wrote fragments based on Sellers' chants and things. And Moses Simons knew this, and that's where he got the melody from. Anyway, so he wrote this song, which is full of classic Cuban, sexy double entendres.
Right,
you know,
right. Yeah,
come on, honey, before you go to bed every night, you have to eat a cone of my nuts.
yeah.
And that's one of the...
Well,
and then
yeah.
in America, when it got to be when it was a hit on stage, everyone said, oh, we have to have an English version of it.
Yeah, okay.
This American woman called Marion Sunshine wrote a version in which the line goes, 50 million monkeys can't be wrong. And, so the dumbing down of... It's a great long history of dumbing down of great lyrics from abroad when they get translated into English.
Well, my grandfather was Latin American dance champion of Leicestershire, and every every Thursday, he was a really good dancer. They used to go on every Thursday to the Grand Hotel in Leicester and dance to Latin music, but of course it was like Victor Sylvester, people like that from the 50s, and it was like very popular. But I think it was obviously watered down, the rhythms, because they couldn't quite cope in Leicestershire with the, more African stuff. But it was a big. That's what I was actually in my mother's stomach. I was listening to my granddad's Latin, 50s Latin stuff. So I had this clave rhythm before I was even born. So that was first place I went to travel outside of Europe was Cuba. Anyway, I'm just saying that was my little...
Which is a very nice segue to the fact that when Mrs. Harrison was pregnant with George in the war years, she loved listening to Indian music late at night.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
You could get all these fascinating facts. I mean, I think I know a certain amount about world music, if you like, 40 years. But, I mean, these are, you get these absolute gems of these stories on almost every page from Joe's book. So it's really worth... And whoever it was it Raikou that said it should be taught in schools?
Yeah. That
Fair
was
enough.
Quote, yeah.
Fair enough. It'd be a really interesting course. Sorry, you were saying, so George Harrison.
Yeah, George. I mean, that was another little gem I unearthed. I mean, I unearthed these things. I was always as delighted to find these little things in my reading. And one of the great scenes that I evoke in the book is during the middle of the 1965 American tour by the Beatles. They had a week off after Shea Stadium, and they rented Zsa Zsa Gabor's house in Beverly Hills, and they had parties every night. And they had become pals with the Byrds when the Byrds came to England.
Okay.
Had come the earlier that year, and so Lennon and Harrison, out of their heads, on LSD, marijuana, whatever else was going around, were sitting in, what's that we're hearing? We're sitting in Zsa Zsa Gabor's bathtub. No water, of course, it was dry.
Right.
And Dave Crosby and Roger McGuinn were standing at the edge of it, playing their guitars and explaining Indian music to George and John, because they had been converted by the fact that they shared a studio. Their rehearsal studio was where Ravi Shankar gave his master classes, and so they'd been exposed to Indian music, and they lectured George and John on how wonderful this music was. And when George went back to England, he went to HMV right around the corner from EMI in Manchester Square, to the HMV shop, and bought all the Ravi Shankar records. And then 2 weeks later, after he listened to them, he went to the India craft store and bought a sitar and an instruction book.
I didn't. That's all good stuff. I think we should hear a bit of this in that case. Should mention this was So this was at the same time. Artie Berman was in Bombay listening to Latin music and all kinds of stuff and
Yeah.
doing his whole, doing world music in Bombay in 1960s, if you like.
I mean, he was, I mean, a very important figure, but you could say, I mean, in terms of if you take the long view of Indian traditional South Asian culture, he was a villain. Bollywood kind of destroyed a lot of Indian traditions because it brought in so much Western influence into the music that it diluted the rhythms particularly. And that's sort of one of my hobby horses in the book, one of my things I bang on about in a very nice way, of course, that music lives in the rhythms. And Bollywood became so powerful and so all-pervasive across India that it kind of obliterated, it strangled at birth any possibility of a domestic record industry because it was just so powerful. The only records that sold were Bollywood soundtracks. And
well, I'm a bit more, I think if we're influenced by Indian music, why can't they be influenced by us, sort of thing?
Well, they can, but it's just... And I guess it really comes down to the subject, to the fact that I never heard a Bollywood track that I found particularly interesting to listen to when I'm not watching the movie, or even when I am.
Right.
It's like they've got nothing, they're all mimed, and...
But I think that's perfectly sensible. You should have the good singers doing the singing and the actresses and the good-looking ones doing the miming. It just makes complete sense to me.
Sure. Listen, it makes it. Listen, obviously, you're more right than I am because it's conquered the world. Bollywood movies were hugely popular
in Russia as well. I'm talking about communism. Yeah.
Because they were gaudy and colorful, and they didn't advertise Western American materialism, and they were very...
Well, I should say, okay, I'll give you an example. When I was in Pakistan, there were these sort of purists that saying, the thing about Qawwali, the harmonium is a foreign instrument. We shouldn't be having it. We should get rid of the harmonium because it's brought over by Scottish missionaries or something. So there's you know what I mean? I think the purist argument is limited. I'm just trying to...
I sort of agree with them. I think the harmonium is... they learned how to use it in a way that sort of fit in with the traditional songs and the traditional way of singing. But I think the original drones, the kind of way that before the harmonium, the instrumentation was somehow more interesting. But, that's just me.
Well, I suppose that's part of, in a way, this is slightly... And I sort of agree. I don't really want to, but I suppose up until about 1984, I could have told you all the songs in the charts in England, and then I sort of felt, and then I did my first 2 interviews with Fela Kuti and Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. So I thought, wow, this is incredible. It's sort of downhill ever since. So I thought, obviously all these geniuses, and there were, like, I don't know, Caetano Veloso, I would call a genius. A lot, maybe not on that level, but it was this completely. I said, I'm also getting the energy you didn't get that I used to get from British pop music.
Well, you're a poster boy for my thesis, which is that one of my theses, that as long as music is a bit like weather. There was a high pressure system in Anglo-American popular music all throughout from 1953 through 1975, 6. There was so much great stuff happening and so much creativity.
Yeah.
And then by the late 70s, disco and punk came along, and the whole tone, the whole thing sort of went downhill a little bit, at least for people like who were interested.
Well, to be honest, I like, some of disco to dance to. It's great. And also, I think at the time, my first year at uni, there were all these sort of, it was the back end of hippiedom. A lot of people like smoking dope, playing board games, and listening to, the classic example was Tales of Topographic Ocean, some triple album Tolkien-esque stuff. Then I could see Eddie and the Hot Rods at Nashville, And then which I got my hair cut, and I was with the Eddie and the Hot Rods crowd.
Yeah,
If you see what I
no,
mean.
listen, makes perfect sense. But it did result in a de-emphasis of virtuosity and roots and soul and all those things that music had brought to very many listeners.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay. Well, I'm not
and,
so
and,
convinced about.
and that created a low-pressure zone. And when you have a low-pressure zone, weather systems from far away rush in to occupy that space. And so I think that starting in the early 80s, people started listening to African music, to
Right.
Cuban music, to Latin music, to Brazilian music. There became a real sort of market, the growing of a market for music from outside the Anglo-American bubble. And I think that was a response to weakness, to the fact that the music was not as interesting anymore as you just said yourself.
Yeah.
When the minute you interviewed Fela and Nusrat, you said, "Why am I wasting my time on the local punks?" You know.
Well, I just think that at the time it was exciting.
Exactly.
The energy was there. And I don't want to listen to it now, but I mean, it was like.
Well, exactly.
But yeah, I mean, you're probably. But then if you're sort of saying that. Well, I'm not sure I really go along with virtuosity per se. You know, I remember this. Who was it? This. I saw Arturo Sandoval, the trumpet player, in Havana, and he was kind of, great musician, but he was with the band, and everyone had to dance. So he had his solos, but it was within the band. Then I saw him at Ronnie Scott's when he'd left Cuba.
Right.
And he was, huge number of notes, and everyone was applauding his virtuosity. But it wasn't, you know what I mean? It was virtuosity in the service of something else. In other words, there's so much.
And listen, I'm the first one to say that I much prefer hearing great jazz solos when people are dancing.
Right.
Than when people are sitting. I talked about that in the Dizzy Gillespie section of the book. Dizzy wanted jazz to be a dance music. And that's why he got Chano Pozo from Cuba to join the band. And he tried to have this music that people could dance to. That was Manteca, his only hit single. People danced to that. But a lot of people in jazz didn't want that. They wanted jazz to be serious. They wanted it to be a concert music.
Well, I mean, I don't mind, you don't dance to Kind of Blues. It's still a great record, right?
Can you dance to Kind of Blue?
Well, not anyway. You wouldn't like to see anyone dance to. But I mean, it obviously there's concert jazz, if you like, as you sit there and listen to it.
Yeah, listen, there's some fantastic things in that, of course. But that is what you just described with Sandoval. I mean, that is an issue, and I've always been fascinated or I tried to make records, that Ivo Popazov record, the Cubanismo record, where music that I thought was a very high level that was also very danceable.
Well, also, I suppose it is a cultural thing, because I think you can't really survive in Cuba without some commute. If you run out of a spare part for your car, you got to know somebody's cousin, knows someone who works in the factory. You can't be isolated. So there's this group energy, and you do feel a lot of. I don't know, maybe I'm exaggerating, but you say some British jazz group, it's like, okay, now I've got my solo, I'm going to show you how many notes I can do. Whereas, in fact, when I did a bit of recording in Cuba myself with Juan de Marcos, the project never came out. This is before Buena Vista, long story. We were going to do a sort of opera musical. So we did a bit of recording. Anyway, they, the people saying, oh, there's this guy, and he's a bass player, and he's like Jaco Pastorius, he's like, plays lots of notes.
Juan Formel.
No, Juan Formel, actually. They did meet Juan Formel, but at the Tropical, as opposed to Tropicana. The Tropical was a more working class place. But anyway, then we got Cachaito on bass, and he hardly plays any notes in relative, you know what I mean? And I think this is quite a mystery to me. I don't know if you could throw any light on it. So he'd be doing like ding, 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 ding. Hardly any notes. the same notes as a lot of other people, but people immediately recognize this is a great musician, even though he's playing the same notes in the same place as other people. What makes that a great musician, do you think?
It's the nuance of the way he plays it. I mean, Cachaito comes from an incredible lineage.
Right.
Cachao, his father,
Yeah.
was the reinvented Cuban bass.
Uh-huh.
And he based it on Arsenio Rodriguez's trace playing, and who played those sorts of counter melodies, those lines that underpinned dancing in Cuba in the 30s and 40s.
Right.
And Cachao was one, and Arsenio was playing for the rough sort of black crowds in the poor sections.
Yeah.
And Cachao brought those patterns that Arsenio was playing on the trace
Right.
into the bass that he was playing with, more respectable bands.
Right.
And eventually those patterns evolved into the mambo.
Right.
And
Well, there's a whole 100 pages of your book, all telling this whole story, and it could have gone on for 500 pages. I mean,
Yeah.
So it's
And so I
well,
think-
if you ever feel bored, you want to do a whole 2 hours on that subject. Literally, you could
Yeah.
play a lot of stuff on it, right?
Yeah,
Because it's
yeah.
fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
We were talking about virtuosity, but some people, it's like they're more like conceptualists, right? They haven't. I mean, you start the book with Malcom Mclaren, who couldn't
Yeah.
play any instrument, but he was an interesting artist. I feel,
For some, yeah.
well, no, I
Yeah.
knew him. I thought he was
Yeah.
kind of brilliant. But I mean, in the same way that, well, you probably don't agree with this either. But if you're modern art, you don't actually have to kill
just
a
have an
shark or
yeah,
something.
you-
You just find the shark, put it in a tank.
Well, yeah.
And
that's-
call it art.
Some people say that, but it's
You
not
know,
my
it's
taste.
not your taste.
And in a way, my book is a polemic on the other side of the question. That in a way that Malcom Mclaren was a charlatan, and Paul Simon was a musician, and Malcolm went to South Africa, didn't pay the people very well, ripped off their copyrights.
Well, the guy from the Art of Noise, what's he called, Gary Langan, said that 2 people got married on the basis of Duck Rock, and they were very happy with the money they got. That's what he told me. But
Right. Well, I mean, he did pay them, and it probably was a lot of money for them at the time, but it was nowhere near as much money as Paul Simon paid them. And Malcolm copyrighted all the tunes that he recorded down there in his own name.
I think that okay. I think I'm not. I'm not claiming Malcolm was any kind of saint. I think the thing is, and I think you said in the book, the deal he had with Charisma meant that they had to get the publishing. Otherwise, so I mean, he didn't.
Well,
and
I mean,
eventually
oh,
that was.
Is that justified?
No, it's not.
No,
but it's the
okay.
only way it was going to happen.
Right.
And I think by now, they re-released Duck Rock, and they have actually got the composers in.
Right,
I'm pretty
yeah.
sure about
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Because as you said, there was a rather embarrassing compilation called Duck Food.
Yeah, yeah.
Which
exactly.
is where it all came from. However, I do think Malcolm was a kind of genius, and I was his agent when he tried to run for London mayor, and he was a very funny guy.
Yeah, I'm sure. I met
And
him
brilliant.
once.
And we just hear a little bit, just to see. Just. Okay, so that was a bit of double Dutch. Now, I think you were saying that. You if you never heard his voice again, it would be too soon, sort of thing. But I think it's a piece of art, and video, as you mentioned, is absolutely brilliant. And he was also this sort of producer figure who introduced hip hop and South African music and waltzes from the middle of Midwest to a bigger audience, in a way, in that one record.
Well, it didn't really at the time. I mean, I think what was the one that was a hit in the UK before the Soweto came out. The the one Jimmy.
Malcolm's been.
Yeah, Malcolm's hit.
Look it up. Anyway, he had
Buffalo Gals.
Buffalo Girls Go Round the Outside.
Exactly.
Which was from a square. Well, to me, the
A square
idea of
dance.
putting a square dance with a hip hop group. I mean, who the hell would think of that? I mean, it's kind of brilliant. You got to admit.
No, I think it's pretty stupid, but it's definitely original. And
It's original, and it's
it's
got
original.
energy and stuff like that.
Yeah, but it's in a way. What I talk about in the book is this way that music kind of merges and blends and combines, but it doesn't always work. And I kind of relished what a big failure Malcolm's record was.
He had some hits, he said.
I know, but that record sank without a trace. I mean, that was that LP at the time, as you say. They're trying to resurrect it now, but it was not something.
Well, if I'm being rude about, I just think he was a friend of mine, so
yeah,
that's one thing. But also, and rather, I remember I had flu. He rang me every single day saying, "How's your flu, mate?"
listen,
Who else would do? None of my other
guy.
friends would do that.
I'm sure he was a great guy, but
That doesn't mean, I'm just saying his image, and he presented himself as a charlatan in that ridiculous film he did.
Yeah.
He was playing around. He's like, he didn't know how much was in his bank account. You know what I mean? He's like, he died with 150 grand, I think. So he, as a sort of rip-off artist, he wasn't very successful anyway, and he didn't really care. And also, it was a sort of, anyway,
well, listen, we just
all right. We'll agree to disagree
we
about
can agree to
Malcolm, because I
disagree
think
with Malcolm,
in a way Paul Simon was a kind of friend of yours. Or you known him a long time.
No,
anyway.
he's not a friend.
You hung out. You met him in the '60s, I guess.
I did, but I never hung out with him.
All right. Well, now we've got an excuse to play this, 'cause we're running slow on time now. Okay, so that was Simon and Garfunkel, who's a different approach to South Africa. Although he also got into trouble for being, I think we don't have to go around this whole thing again, but he was put down for breaking the apartheid rules, but in fact, as you said, he did a lot to.
Well, not only that, but one of the things that always puzzled me was when the ANC was ranting about Paul Simon breaking the boycott, the cultural boycott. As this was happening, people were flocking on Broadway and the West End to Ethel Fugard plays, Master Harold and the Boys, and Sizri Banzi is Dead. They were winning Tony Awards and all this kind of stuff. They were market theater productions with South African mixed cast of white and black South African actors that had been picked up lock, stock, and barrel and brought from Johannesburg to London and then London to New York. There was absolutely no conceptual or structural difference between those productions and Graceland.
Also, Robin Denslow tells this story to me. It was like about, I think it was a gig at the Royal Albert Hall where Hugh Masekela, Miriam Makeba, and was Paul Simon on the set? I don't think so. Anyway, but outside there was like Billy Bragg and Paul Weller protesting against this breaking of apartheid, when presumably Hugh Masekela and these people had been fighters against Anthony apartheid.
Exactly.
So there was something slightly absurd about the whole. That seemed to, if I was that scene, there's something slightly absurd about that scene. Do you know what I mean? The sort of lefties outside complaining while the actual activists are inside playing music.
Yeah.
But, I think it was... presumably the boycott did have an effect of some kind.
Of course.
So, it wasn't all bad.
The boycott was a very good idea. But the ANC turned a blind eye to Ethel Fugard because they thought it was good for the movement, or good for the image, or good for the shifting of public opinion and creating empathy. And so was Graceland.
So that's...
It's a
I think
great
you
record.
say it's a great record, and after 1984, so it's not a complete success.
Yeah.
But anyway, what's it? Not much more. I don't know. Anyway, you kind of pretty much say that had quite an impact in getting Mandela released, Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the concert in Wembley,
Yeah.
the birthday concert,
Yeah.
Graceland, the Jerry Dammers Specials record that
Yeah.
you just played, I think they all had a huge effect. I mean, obviously there was international. I mean, I think the South Africans were tired of not being able to play Test cricket.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, yeah.
and they were tired of,
Yeah.
of not being able to play rugby, and so the boycotts worked in a way, but I think the wave of popular culture that brought, because Reagan and Thatcher were tried to paint Mandela as a terrorist.
Right, right.
They had this. They've tried to say the ANC was a terrorist organization, a bit like, people are trying to demonize Palestinians today, and say,
Right.
and to make any kind of empathy with that movement into a something.
Somebody told me it was the Queen, because she believed in the Commonwealth, who was told Thatcher to knock off this Mandela as a terrorist thing.
I don't know. That might be interesting if that was true, but I think once all of these things happened, the Jerry Dammers single, the concert,
Right.
Graceland, they were just pissing into the wind. They couldn't get away with calling Mandela and the ANC terrorists. And
I mean, it's a great thing. In fact, my one of my greatest, successes as a journalist was I interviewed Jerry Dammers, before this came out, and I got it into Soweto Times and the ANC, all that,
right.
and really pushed it, and then that had an effect. And about 5 years later, I saw Jerry Dammers on the tube, and he came up and shook my hand and said, "Well done, mate, thanks." So that it wasn't. I haven't had an entirely wasted life. I had a few things like that that paid off, if you know.
Right.
You know what I mean? Or seemed to be the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Anyway, so music can change the world a bit. We've had, what examples? We felt the Beatles kind of changed Russia, and the jazz did, and, we've had various... I suppose what's changed now is because everything's so fragmented. I mean, I think when, the Specials were there,
Everybody heard it.
20 million people would see it on Top of the Pops or whatever it was.
And it was inescapable. You heard it everywhere.
So, but I'm just thinking, is that the case? Well, in my squat, the next door neighbour was Jem Finer, who wrote A Fairy Tale in New York with... so that's everywhere.
That's
still
everywhere.
Also his pension.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So there are some songs that are still ubiquitous, but maybe they're old songs pretty much that are ubiquitous.
Yeah, I think so.
It's
I
like,
think so.
I
mean, I don't know. But we're for an older generation. I'm sure for young people there are Taylor Swift songs that are completely inescapable. There are Beyonce songs that are completely inescapable.
Yeah. That's true, isn't it?
And are part of everybody's memory, and they will look back with great.
Yeah, I think that's true. That must be true. You're a Swiftie, but I wonder if it's quite the same as, everyone talking about David Bowie being on Top of the Pops. Sort of the night. It seems a bit different. The other thing that is different is you and I, presumably, we'd be going to Stearns and buying African music. You were a Stearns aficionado, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So you'd shell out, and it was like, what was it? You kind of, you sort of have a bit of a gamble because you like the look of it or something, but you spend 50, 20 quid. It was a lot of money. So you got it. You had to. First of all, there's a fetish object, the album, but also you probably heard it 20 times because you spent all that money on it. That seems to be a big cultural shift, is it not? Because people just jumped. We're doing this on Spotify, actually. So,
well, but it's interesting that there's a kind of,
vinyl
revival. In a way, the vinyl revival, which is interesting, because people want that object, and the difficulty of taking it out of its sleeve and dusting it off and placing it on the turntable and dropping the needle without scratching it, and and getting the tubes warmed up, and everything is a ritual that many people seem to enjoy. Which
Do
is
you
great.
think it sounds better than CD vinyl?
Well, that's a tricky question, because if the vinyl was cut from an analog master tape,
Okay, that's
back
true. A lot of them
before
are.
before the 1980s,
Yeah.
before 1985,
Yeah.
it'll sound fantastic.
Right.
And most vinyl cut today, actually, vinyl cut from 2000 to 2022
Yeah.
is probably cut from a digital source.
Right.
But now people are starting to take more obsessive care about that, and you're starting to get high-end vinyl that's cut from analog or cut from a very, very high-end digital signal, and that does sound better than streaming for sure.
You also, one interesting part was just really, it was about, we've done Buena Vista, but it's interesting that they tried to get them in the Studio 2 in a Graham, as opposed to the you were saying it would have sold 10,000
Exactly.
in the wrong studio. So the people perhaps aren't, there's sort of music could be in the walls of that studio, the atmosphere. It's
Well, it
like a
wasn't
kind of
just that.
shrine or something.
Well, it wasn't just the atmosphere and the music in the walls. It was the process. The Studio 2, the modern studio downstairs, was padded and dead as a room. There was no reverb from the walls.
Yeah.
They had all these little isolation booths. They had all these jacks you plugged in directly to the board for your drum machine or your synth keyboard. It was a different way of making records.
Yeah.
And when I went in the first day, because I did Cubanismo, we did that like 8 months before Buena Vista.
Yeah.
And I went in there with these incredible musicians. We had a fantastic session. And I thought it was one of the greatest days I'd ever had in the studio.
Right.
And one of the young sax players came to me afterwards, and he said, "So that was a really fun day. That was great. That's a great demo. Great demo." And I said, no. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "No, that's the master."
This story, amongst many others, is in Joe's book, and I think we're sort of running out of time. But we've.
You tell me what we can do and what we can't now.
Well,
Peter.
I think it struck me. Funnily enough, my first day in Havana, which was '86, I think, was the day Enrique Herrán died. And all the night, I thought, well, I'm in Havana, I've got to get out,
Right.
And they were all dark to mark the passing of Enrique Herrán, the inventor of the cha-cha-cha, which went worldwide.
Right. Yeah.
If you go to the sound archive, you can find cha-cha-chas in the Philippines, Vietnam, everywhere.
Yeah.
And he died. And Ruben Gonzalez played with Enrique Herrán, and he said, that's the end of the old music, really. And it seemed to be. That was '86.
Yeah.
And it was only these
10 years later.
10 years later, these eccentric colonialists.
Well, but also, but you can't put it all on us eccentric colonialists. Juan de Marcos
Yes,
and Jesus Alemany
absolutely.
were young music students.
Yeah.
And in those days, no one was interested in the past. Everyone was charging
That's true.
forward.
So
with
he was
Irakere
quite.
and Van
So I
Van.
agree. So Juan de Marcos doesn't get enough credit for that
Yeah.
Buena Vista anyway, because he did all the arrangements and brought Ibrahim and Ruben in.
Exactly. And I think that these guys were Cubans who, inside Cuban culture, they decided to turn around and look at the past and celebrate the past.
Well, I've
and
got
keep those styles alive. It wasn't outside.
And he was an intellectual guy. He read,
It
Dostoevsky, the original Russian, and all that.
It
Juan de
wasn't,
Marcos.
it
was
wasn't
like
outsiders coming in and saying, "Let's do this."
all right, but it was all right. It was a combination of the two.
Yeah.
In fact, well, I've got one little self-serving story, which was that the Caribbean Music Village, which I was working part-time for, they had to decide, I think it was 92, whether to bring, there was an argument, do we bring Maniquitas de Matanzas?
Muñequitas de Matanzas,
or Sierra Maestra. So I argue very strongly Sierra Maestra. I thought it would be a really fun group to have on a festival. Lucy was saying, no, we've got to have the Muñequitas, Lucy Duran. Anyway, I won the argument. Sierra Maestra came.
And then she married Sierra Maestra.
And then Sierra Maestra got deal with Nick Gold. Then that ended up being Buena Vista. So if they hadn't come to that festival, so basically I'm responsible for Buena Vista, just
Absolutely.
so you know, and Nick should be giving me
Yeah.
large sums of money.
Absolutely.
So I mean, but I'm sure we've all got little bits of, connections that happen, and I mean, you had done such a lot. I was thinking of a couple of. Let's talk about failures. One failure of yours was, we got 3 minutes or something.
No, we're running out of time.
All right, we'll fade out.
30 seconds.
Oh well, you better fade out.
No, you can carry on for a minute or two.
All right, can we?
Okay.
All right, because we
Yeah, I'll
started
let
a bit
you
late.
Okay.
Okay.
Failures.
2 Swedish guys came to see you with their publishing in 1970.
No.
Is that
quite
right?
not quite like that.
Okay.
I bought a record when I was in Stockholm
Uh-huh.
of these 2 Swedish guys
Yeah.
singing. It was just an interesting looking record. Took it home, played it. I thought, wow, these songs are really good, but they're all in Swedish.
Yeah.
And then I discovered. Hold on, I know. Before that, somebody had played me a song by the Hep Stars,
Okay.
and the lead singer was a guy called Benny Anderson,
Okay.
and it was in English, and
Uh-huh.
it was kind of a rip-off of Daydream
Okay.
by the Lovin' Spoonful. And then I saw Benny Anderson's name on this record in Stockholm, and I bought it. It was all in Swedish. And then I went to Sweden. I went to Stockholm, and I saw their publisher, their manager and publisher, Stig Anderson. And I said, listen, these guys should be writing in English, and I'll be their publisher outside of Sweden. And we did a deal where he would publish Nick Drake and Fairport Convention.
Yeah.
I would publish Benny and Bjorn. And then before we could sign the deal, I got offered a job at Warner Brothers, and I moved to California, and the deal never
Damn.
happened.
So there's a few ones that. What's your philosophy? Some stuff just gets away from you. You could have done the Buena Vista thing. You could have recorded Pink Floyd's first album. I mean, you had a few
Listen,
annoying near misses, I guess, right?
Sure, but I've had so much that had worked. I've had a fantastic life in music. I mean, I
You
have absolutely no regrets about anything.
Well, that's fantastic. Just to say again, read this book. One of the things I found, it's great to read a book and you hear stuff. I heard this track for the first time in 20 years, and it's fantastic. So we'll leave you this. Thanks very much, Joe.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
No, I would not give you false hope.